Sige, I will start here. So yung goals natin last week so yung point ng dalawa nating readings was for you to be able to understand and describe yung colonial character of psychology, as we know it. And then to discuss the effects of the Western dominance in the development of psychology. So ano ba yung problema ng isang Euro-American-centric or Western psych? And then, yung isang importanteng construct that we need to clarify tonight is culture. And I'll explain later how is that related to Sikolohiyang Pilipino. Okay. So let's talk about the colonial character of psychology. So I skimmed through your worksheets, from last week, and a lot of you gave very similar responses. So I just like to summarize ano ba yung point, kung bakit yun yung una nating pinabasa. Interesting siya for me kasi, and I hope it was also interesting for you, dahil hindi natin siya experience. No? Experience siya na India. But I wanted you to read it para makita ninyo na hindi tayo nag-iisa dito sa indigenous psychology movement. No? At yung dangers ng uninational dominance ng Western or Euro-American psychology, hindi lang siya sa Pilipinas. No? Pero yung epekto niya, kasama pati yung mga mostly previously colonized cultures. So the point of the article, yung Batia article, ay for us to realize psychology is not exactly objective. The psychology is not exactly value-free. Yun yung point. Yung psychology is a site of power. In fact, unequal power relations. It's also a site of inequalities. At nagagawa yan ng isang disiplina through its exclusionary discourses and practices. If you want, I can share with you this article by Narcisa Paredes Canilao and Barbara Diaz. So may question sa reading memo about what it means to be a critical psychology, and this article sort of analyzes SP using that critical emancipatory lens. So, yun yung point ng sinasabi ni Batia. Kailangan natin ma-realize yung negative effects ng psychology kung hindi natin siya babaguhin. Tapos from the reading memo, I'd like to share with you one of the responses when I asked you about one of the central arguments. And hopefully, isa rito sa nakuha ninyo na, unfortunately, the psychology that we know remains to be Euro or Western-centric. And maybe, pwede yan ma-manifest. Kunwari, if I ask you, or if you ask other people, tanungin nyo sila, sino yung mga kilala or sikat na psychologists sa tingin ninyo? At na baka yung top of mind ninyo, natin, ng maraming mga tao sa Pilipinas, baka si Freud pa rin, or baka mga psychologists that are European or American nationality. So, maganda yung point na nakuha din sa reading, maganda yung point na nakuha ng isa din yung classmate na yung problematic ay even the previously colonized use this kind of psychology to understand themselves. And we will unpack this problem a little later. So sa Pilipinas, for the longest time, actually, arguably, hanggang ngayon, posible na hindi pa rin lahat on board doon sa paradigm shift na kailangan sa psychology. So yung goal, the point of the article is that there is a need to critique and challenge the Eurocentrism, Orientalism, and educational neocolonialism of psychology. So crucial yung role ng Orientalism kasi and I've seen in some of your worksheets yung point na it's meant to paint a particular picture of what non-whites are. It's meant to paint a particular picture of non-Western individuals. And usually, itong picture na to, nalilegitimize siya. Kasi it becomes canon. Napapublish siya, people consider it as truth. And then, bukod dun sa, that distortion of the picture and then the legitimization of that picture, of what it means to be from the Orient, it leads to, ang isang consequence niya ay discrimination. So, kaya, so ano nangyari, we become inferior based on the standards of Euro-American-centric psychology. I wanted to show this to you because just to make us realize that it is indeed a global movement. So in a study that looked into the origins of indigenous psychology, ito yung ilan sa mga respondents nila. So let's just look at this first and then tignan natin at may napapansin ba kayong similarities ng mga bansang to. So siguro yung ibang makita natin, some of them are from Asia also. No? Pero yung interesting about indigenous psychology, hindi lang siya psikolohiya ng mga may hirap na bansa. No? Psikolohiya din siya ng actually relatively well-off countries. Kaya, at hindi lang din siya psikolohiya ng mga na-colonize necessarily. Although a lot of the countries that you see here have experiences of colonization, and that was a huge impetus why indigenous psychology was born. So marami tayong mga kapitbahay na may version din sila ng SP nila. So if we are going to look at the study of Alwood and Berry, so ito si Alwood and Berry, humingi siya so nag-contact siya noong mga indigenous psychology pioneers in the countries that we listed in the previous slide. Kasi yun niya, bakit kayo nagkaroon ng sarili ninyong psychology or indigenous psychology? At ito yung insights no, from that article. Una, the zeitgeist was perfect no, for change. So kung maalala natin yung kasaysayan ng SP, nagsimula siya formally around 1975. No? So 1975 din yung unang konferensya ng Sikolohiyang Pilipino at doon din tinatag yung pambansang samahan sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino. So PSSP is actually celebrating its 45th year this year. So during the 70s, so isang description nila of the time. So when we talk about zeitgeist, we talk about the cultural climate during that time. At yung zeitgeist noon ay that of counterculture. Diba? So nung 60s, nung 70s, dyan nagkaroon ng big waves and there was a lot of movements during that time. So yung feminist movement was born out during that time. And then people were just not happy with the status quo. So kumbaga, agit yung mga tao, noong mga panahon na yan. At dahil agit yung mga tao, it was perfect actually for change. So that's why a lot of these indigenous psychologists developed. And then it was, a lot of respondents said it was really a response to anti-Western domination. And then later on, I'll tell you what are the issues of this kind of domination. And then, I think interestingly, a lot of these countries saw ill fit of Euro-American or mainstream psychology when it came to solving local problems or when it came to trying to understand local experiences. So parang hindi nagtutugma or hindi laging relatable or hindi laging applicable. So yun nga yung sinasabi ni Dr. Enriquez when he came back home. Pag uwi niya, martial law. Sabi niya, bakit parang nasa ivory tower yung mga psychologists yung inaaral natin? Bakit tayo nag-aaral ng, kasi noong panahon na yun, usong-uso yung Skinner box. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's this box that we use for experiments. Tapos meron ka doon pigeon or an animal that we usually use for our experimental studies. Tapos ang inaaral mo yung how, for example, yung reinforcement. No? Pag binigyan mo ng food, gagawa ng ganitong behavior, yung pigeon, etc. No? So, ang pakiramdam nito kay because martial law, there's abject poverty all around, the people are suffering. What is our discipline doing? So, may ganong realization. And kagaya nga na nabanggit ko, SP was, a lot of indigenous psychologies were shaped by global and local events. So, parang nagsama-sama yung iba't ibang klase ng movements for the change. So later on, we'll focus on the role of culture. So I'll leave it here for now. And then also, there was still a question of, at tinanong ko rin sa inyo dun sa slide sa SP, meron bang prescribed method pag indigenous psychology? No? So why is this question important? So psychology and Sikolohiyang Pilipino in particular is a discipline. Diba? Kapag sabi mong may disiplina, parang merong tamang paraan ng paggawa ng mga bagay-bagay. At bahagi ng pagiging isang disiplina ay dapat malinaw paano mo aaralin yung mga bagay-bagay. At nakita nila Alwood and Berry, all over the world that there was no prescription when it came to research methods. So yung flavor ng indigenous psychology ay pwedeng i-develop ng kanya-kanyang mga bansa. So some indigenous psychologies were still highly positivist, highly experimental, highly quantitative. No? Sa Philippines, when we were starting, a lot of our studies were highly phenomenological. It was really delving into local experiences. Experience mo ng sumpong, experience mo ng hiya, experience mo ng utang na loob. No? And a lot of our methods, yung suggested methods were highly oral, highly qualitative. No? Pakikipagkwentuhan, pagtatanong-tanong, which kind of shows you that yung flavor ng research, at least when we were starting, ay very relational, na napakahalaga ng idea ng establishing rapport, being able to talk about experiences more than just simply reporting. Okay. So let's go to the next point. No? Ano ba yung effects ng uni-national dominance in psychology? So, bakit siya uni-national dominance? So, siguro we can frame it this way. Yung direction ng knowledge kasi ay one way. So, yung West, so yung America, mostly, Europe, sila yung may control. So, sila yung gatekeepers ng knowledge. So, yung inaaral natin halimbawa, so if you have experience studying general psychology or introduction to psychology, Psych 101, so yung textbook natin doon, American yung authors usually. At yung experiences na babasa natin doon ay research based on American samples. So, yung knowledge, yung knowledge flow from them to us. Pero napaka-rare na tayo can have a huge impact the way that they do to us pagdating sa development ng psychological knowledge. And in fact, isa sa mga lament namin, kapag nagsumusubok kami, and I don't know if you experienced this, pag nagsumusubok kami na mag-publish ng research sa international journals, parang ang daming justification na kailangan gawin. I mean, importante naman talaga to justify your choice of methods, your choice of topics, but parang justifying why that problem is important. Ang hirap niya gawin kapag sa atin galing yung knowledge, pero sa kanila, it's usually taken for granted. Parang it's assumed that it's important and we need to study it. So, yan yung isa sa mga issues. Dun sa reading memo, may nagtanong, I think, so baka gusto rin i-clarify ni Alan yung question niya. Parang may confusion dun sa idea ng angat patong. So, I don't know if this will help, pero yung idea, ang ganda niya sa akin metaphorically. So, angat, so as in importing wholesale psychological knowledge from the West, and then patong, as in to apply it without any adaptation, without any critique or challenge. No? So, basically applying after wholesale importation, anything from the West to our experiences. So, kasama dyan sa angat patong yung concepts, theories, pati yung mga methodologies. Okay? So, yun yung idea ng angat patong. So, I don't know if that clarifies the concept. No? Kung sakaling hindi pa, at hindi ko masyadong na-catch yung question, can you just kindly interrupt me or write in the chat box what the question was about? Okay.
Okay, sir. Okay po.
Okay, thank you, Alan.
Okay.
So, ano yung consequence nun? So, ang consequence nun ay yung psychology natin nagiging copycat. Gaya-gaya siya ng psikolohiya. Um, so, tignan natin, no? Let's try to explore this further. Is this something that we should problematize? Eh, ano namang problema kung gaya-gaya yung psychology? No? So, ilan sa mga features dun ay, and sobrang guilty rin ako dito, hindi naman ako magmamalinis. Halimbawa, yung paggamit ng English sa pagtuturo or sa pagsusulat ng research, no? Or yung halimbawa yung that the Western standard is the standard, and if it's from the West, it must be good. And then there's always focus on literature from the West, developed parang highly developed na yung kanila, yun yung impression. No? Maybe that's partially true, and therefore yun yung gold standard pagdating sa paggawa ng research at pag-develop ng field. And then we usually follow yung trends sa Western psychology. So kung ang trend, so feeling ko nga kung mayaman yung Pilipinas at meron tayong resources, halimbawa for brain scanning images, brain scanning equipment, or eye tracking devices. No? Ang mahirap lang kasi yung UP. Pero feeling ko kung marami tayong pera, probably we would have these kinds of equipment, and we'd probably be doing a lot of neuropsychological research, which is very important, but maybe in the grand scheme of things in the Philippines, maybe not the most important. So, ano yung consequence? Yung consequence ay, at nabanggit na natin to dun sa slide that I sent you, it's the marginalization or exclusion of local narratives and experiences. So, ibig sabihin, our experiences are not in the center, hindi tayo yung bida. Our voices are not usually heard. So, it's very rare to see a textbook where you see experiences of diverse Asian representation. Kasi sa kanila sa mga textbooks, yung Asia, usually East Asia eh. So kasi sila rin yung nagko-control ng knowledge. So East Asia, so Japan, Korea, to a certain extent, China. Pero yung karanasan natin, wala. So hindi laging relatable yung psychology. There could also be a distortion in the understanding of our experiences. So yun yung nagiging problema kung i-insist natin to translate our concepts. Yung isa sa mga unang pag-aaral sa psychology in the Philippines was really foreigners or Americans, halimbawa, trying to understand local concepts. So kaya ang nangyayari, nag-iiba yung meaning. So utang na loob, nagiging debt of gratitude. So parang nagiging quid pro quo, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. No? O yung hiya as simply shame. Yan yung mga classic examples. Eh. So instead of us fully understanding our experiences using our own lenses, gumugulo siya. No? Or hindi siya laging malinaw. At yung isang consequence na hindi ko na masyadong i-elaborate kasi si Batya has excellently done this, yung Orientalism. Okay, so in the creation, legitimization, and discrimination as a result of a particular image of non-Western individual. So, sige, before I proceed, may question daw si Pia. Yes, please.
Hello, sir. Yes po. Good evening po. Yung question po related dun sa distortion of understanding of experiences. Kapag, ang understanding ko po kasi dito, kapag yung mga dayuhan, pinag-aralan yung mga karanasan natin, maaring maiba yung pakahulugan dito na hindi na yun talaga yung meaning para sa atin. Pero po, yung kasing previous na personal kong paniniwala, bahagi pa rin ng psikolohiyang sariling atin yung mga pag-aaral, basta ang pinag-aralan ay Pilipino o yung mga tungkol sa Pilipino, kahit pa mga dayuhan ang nagsagawa nito. Hindi mali po ba yun, sir?
Hindi naman siya mali. No? So, kung tama yung understanding, Pia, correct me kung hindi ko masyado na-catch yung question. My understanding sa sinabi mo ay bahagi ng psychological knowledge sa Pilipinas, yung mga pag-aaral na ginawa tungkol sa atin kahit na foreigners yung nag-aral.
Yes po, opo.
Okay. And actually, and to a certain extent, yan naman precisely yung sinasabi ni Dr. Enriquez na it still falls under psikolohiya sa Pilipinas. No? And I think what is important about your point is pwede siyang take off, no, doon sa pag-aaral na pwede mo pang gawin. No, kasi usually, yung mga research na ginagawa naman natin, they're based on something. So, halimbawa, we disagree with the conceptualization of HIA. So, doon sa isang research na ginawa namin on HIA, we looked at yung mga classic studies on HIA and we figured, baka okay na if we propose a different kind of definition for that. So, useful siya in that regard that it can be a take-off point for future studies. But it becomes dangerous if it's the only way of, if it's the only source that we have about our own experiences. So, yung short answer ay, they're valid studies, lalo na if they're well-made. They form the psychological knowledge or vocabulary of psychology in the Philippines. However, it's our task, no? To kind of be critical about these things and see whether nakakatulong sila sa pag-unawa, no, ng ating mga karanasan. Yun. So I hope I was able to answer your question today.
Yes po, sir. Thank you po.
Okay. No? Yeah.
Sir Ton,
Yes, please.
may question lang rin po. Tama po bang isipin na ang mga foreign studies nga na patungkol sa mga Pilipino, part pa rin siya ng psikolohiya ng mga Pilipino, pero you will not, hindi mo siya ituturing as psikolohiyang Pilipino. Parang tama po ba na may distinction na gano'n? Parang psikolohiya ng mga Pilipino siya, pero hindi siya psikolohiyang Pilipino.
That would be a good way to put it. Right? So, I think yung tatlong yun, mamaya pumuntahan natin kasi may question din about that. I think ginamit ni Dr. Enriquez just to emphasize the point that there is, during his time, may existing form, yung psychology, yung psikolohiya ng mga Pilipino, pero merong ideal form, yung kanyang mungkahi na, isang psikolohiya. Okay. Thank you for that, Roddy. Sige. So, let's just go to the last point. Ano yung role ng culture in creating different realities and why is this important? So, yung indigenous psychology, kung saan kabilang yung Sikolohiyang Pilipino, ay isa sa tatlong yung tinatawag nila na culture-oriented psychologies. So I don't want you to be overwhelmed by this slide or by this table, but I just wanted to point out na kung titignan niyo lang yung sa pangalan, so may cross-cultural, may cultural, yung indigenous lang yung wala yung culture sa pangalan. Pero nagkaroon talaga ng movement sa psychology na culture yung naging front and center. Yung vision ng isang indigenous psychology is that culture, so let's just look at the third column. Yung goal talaga niya is that yung kultura mo mismo ang magiging source ng concepts, perspectives, and methods mo. That is the grand idea, which is not very easy to do actually. Kasi ang una mong mahihit na wall dyan ay, but what is culture? No? Which we'll try to define in a bit. But that is the role of culture. Culture now becomes your source of studies. No? Kaya mas madali feeling ko i-conceptualize yung indigenous psych or yung SP. Kasi sa isang pinakamababaw na level, yung Sikolohiyang Pilipino ay pag-aaral ng mga local concepts using locally prescribed methods and analyzing them using local frameworks or perspectives. Okay? So just to have a formal definition of indigenous psychology, again, why am I discussing this? Kasi gusto ko ma-situate natin yung SP doon sa global movement ng culture-oriented psychologies na hindi siya hiwalay sa movement na nangyayari sa buong mundo. So yung SP is an example of an indigenous psychology which is defined as the scientific study of human behavior or mind that is native Anong ibig sabihin? Galing sa atin. It is not transported from other regions and is designed for its people. Okay? So another nice definition of indigenous psychology I'd like to share with you is by Adair. Si Adair, Canadian to, sikat na indigenous psychologist. No? Sa kanya, naabot mo na yung nilalayong anyo, no? Ng indigenous psychology. Pag naabot mo na yung ideal form to the extent that your theories, concepts, research problems, hypotheses, methods, and measures emanate from, adequately represent, and for which the results reflect back upon the cultural context. Okay? Rather than coming from and addressing a foreign research literature. So if I remember correctly, merong nagbanggit sa inyo sa reading memo na sana umabot na yung Sikolohiyang Pilipino sa punto na hindi na natin kailangan mag-indigenize from without. No? Pero dahil relatively baby pa yung psych, not relatively mabagal yung development natin, meron pa ring dependence. Kaya hindi pa rin siya fully indigenous psychology, at least sa standards ni Adair. Babalikan ulit natin at tanong natin, what is the role of culture? Maganda yung, to reiterate, no, yung nakita natin sa table kanina, ganda nung sinabi ni Patricia Greenfield. Sabi niya, yung goal talaga natin is to take informal folk theories and formalize them into psychological theories. Ito yung sinasabi natin na culture as source. No? Kasi di ba meron tayong mga paniniwala? Halimbawa, ano ba magandang mga paniniwala natin? Sa pag-aalaga, halimbawa, or mga worldviews na lang, kunwari, na kapag bata ka, hindi ka dapat sumasagot sa magulang mo. Kunwari ganyan. Or, meron pa ba kayong ibang mga naisip na mga pwedeng mga paniniwala or practices natin in the Philippines?
Mga pamahiin po.
Yan, perfect. Okay, so madami tayong mga pamahiin. So yung goal natin, itong mga pamahiin na to, how do they affect the way we think, the way we feel, the way we behave? No? So these are passed on from generation to generation, but our goal in psychology is to test them out, no? Define them psychologically, and then see how they work, or if they work, and then can you provide tentative alternatives for people's beliefs. No? So, kaya yung goal talaga, yung culture, butol ko binabagit, source siya ng formal psychological models. At kung makikita ninyo, kung maalala ninyo yung diagram dun sa slide that I sent you about formalizing local concepts, di ba meron dun parang diagram ng sequence of events? No? That is basically an operationalization of what Greenfield is saying here. Okay? So then finally, let me just end this part with this one. How do we now define culture? It's a very difficult thing to define, even in psychology. We have I think there was a study that said that there are around at least 40 definitions of culture. So I just chose things that I think will be helpful for our inquiry and to have a particular framework. So itong definition na to, ang sinasabi niya, culture, which is a classic definition, culture is a shared meaning system. No? So para kina Smith, yung culture is something that resides in us. So like something in our brain, something in our minds. No? Kasi yung culture for them, it comprises the similar ways of responding to a context, similar ways of processing information, no? and shared interpretations of meaning systems of events occurring within the system. So in fact, sina Smith, ang suggestion nila, baka mainam to use cultural orientation, which is the propensity to define things in a particular way, propensity to interpret surroundings in a particular way, instead of using culture per se. So halimbawa, tampo. So kaya huling nagtampo sa isang tao. Right? So you don't have to answer this naman now, pero just think about, kaya huling nagtampo sa isang tao, paano mo nalaman na tampo yun? Yung tampo is interesting kasi it requires a lot of non-verbal cues, diba? So, dun sa tao na nagtampo ka, alam ba niya na nagtampo ka? O paano niya nalaman na nagtampo ka? Ano yung cues that help that person interpret your behavior na nagtatampo ka? And then how do you kind of resolve something like tampo? So this is an example of what it means to have a shared meaning system. So we were all socialized to be able to experience tampo, detect tampo, and respond to tampo. Yung isang gusto ko ring definition ng culture ay it's an amalgam of bonded elements. No? Kahapon sa class namin, we were talking about psychological concepts as bundle of sticks. No? So, ibig sabihin, it's not one big block of a concept, but it's composed of elements that are related with each other, no? And that you need to unpack them to be able to understand their essence. So yung idea, yung culture is something like this. No? You break it down into its elements, and by understanding each component, it will lead you to a more understanding of Filipino culture, for instance. So I just put here some concepts. So you understand the use of language, understand our belief systems, our values, our norms, no? How we look at ourselves, how we define the Filipino identity. So kapag tignan mo siya separately, pag pinagsama-sama mo siya, then you have a broader, more comprehensive picture of what culture is all about. And what is the implication of that for Sikolohiyang Pilipino is that SP is the study of culture. Particularly, I will reiterate, SP as the source, no, sorry, in Sikolohiyang Pilipino, culture becomes the source, no, of local experiences, local patterns of thinking, and local ways of framing experiences. Okay? So, yung challenge for us is to look into this. Kaya kung mapapansin ninyo, yung huling requirement natin sa klase natin, yung ating guided conversation, essentially, it's operationalizing this. No? We're going to talk about local concepts, studies of local concepts, and we're going to discuss them in order to have a very, very thin slice, the very thin understanding of our culture. So you have a copy of the slide. Let's go over it very quickly. So ano yung goal of this week? So this week, ito dapat yung naging malinaw sa atin. Dapat kaya nating ma-define what SP is at kaya nating ma-describe yung features niya. Particularly that it is both a discipline and movement. No? And then we are going to discuss some suggestions for contributing to SP research and developing the field. How do we develop a culturally sensitive and relevant discipline? So particularly psychology to, but you can also talk about your own experiences in your own field. So how can you tell, halimbawa, if psychology or your discipline is culturally sensitive and culturally appropriate? What do you think are the indicators?
Sir?
Yes, please.
Apo. I think yung magdidikta nun is if yung aspects of indigenization na inintroduce ni na Church at Katigbak ay na-meet or present doon sa studies na kinokonduct sa larangan ng psikolohiya. So yung theoretical and especially yung first three po, theoretical and conceptual, methodological, and topical po.
So, ang sinasabi ni Pia is para sa kanya, culturally relevant and sensitive yung disiplina mo kapag you're able to study local concepts, basically what theoretical conceptual indigenization is saying, if you're using methods that are appropriate in that context, no? Which is debatable kasi feel ko ang next project dapat ng SP ay isang handbook on methodology. Kasi yan yung kulang pa talaga. Kasi marami rin tanong about post-structuralism, halimbawa, and how that can be applied to Sikolohiyang Pilipino. No? But, so, yun yung point, no? Kapag confidently masasabi mo na itong metodo na ginagawa mo sa pag-aaral mo ay sensitive to your context, your culture, to your respondents. No? And then yung third, whether it is able to address issues, no, that are locally relevant.
Sir, yung pagkaano po ba, yung paghimay ng kung ano yung atin at ano yung nahiram, parang ma-distinguish na natin which one was borrowed and which one is really ours in terms of that terms of, na yung ano ba, pananaw apa.
So, ang sasabi mo ba, Mark, parang yun yung indicator para sa'yo kung kaya mo nang clearly to differentiate what is native, what is ours versus what is borrowed or foreign.
Sir?
Yes, please.
May clarification po dun sa sinabi nyo na debatable po yung pagpili ng is tungkol sa methodological na aspect of indigenization.
Yes.
Bakit po siya debatable at the moment?
Okay, sige. So full disclosure, ako kasi hindi ako masyadong stricto sa metodo. Kasi kung titignan niyo yung kasaysayan talaga ng Sikolohiyang Pilipino, mataas talaga yung pagpapahalaga sa mas qualitative methods. Kasi may issue nga, kasi we're trying to decolonize the field. We're trying to be more conscious about power relations, etc. At maraming mga concerns, yung mga methodologists, pagdating sa mas positivistic or mas quantitative na mga metodo. Yung mga nagbibilang, yung mga gumagamit ng statistics, etc. So I'm coming from si Dr. Roji Pepua, meron siyang article about, I forget the exact title, something about cross-indigenous methodology, parang ganyan yung title. So pag titignan natin yung article niya na yun, wala naman siya necessarily piniprescribe na method. No? Ang sinasabi talaga niya mga batayan ay mas ethical na considerations. No? Halimbawa, sasabihin niya na yung mga pag-aaral sa SP dapat ginagamit mo yung wika ng mga kalahok mo. So halimbawa ang argument ko, so if your participants can understand English, so university students yung inaaral mo, and there is no discomfort with that, so maybe that is possible. You can use English, pero obviously hindi yun pwede kapag non-English speaker or non-Tagalog even, no? yung participant. So we use the language of the participant. That was one consideration. And then yung second ay yung to be aware of the power relations, no? Which it can actually be addressed kahit quantitative yan, basta malinaw sa'yo yung kalahok mo yung bida, welfare nila yung kailangan pangalagaan, hindi to about just what the researcher wants or needs, but also what the participants need, no, in the process. So napaka-importante ng debriefing. So what I'm saying here is merong mga safeguards to ensure that the power relations are still, or are kind of, that you're conscious about them and that you're addressing the power imbalance. So kaya ko sinasabi na debatable siya kasi depende kung nasaan kang aspekto or spectrum ng sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino. There are really people who would say there's no space for quantitative studies or experiments, for instance. Ako nandun ako sa paniniwala na ang hindi dapat mauna yung research method. Dapat ang mauuna sa'yo ay ano yung tanong na gusto mong sagutin, ano yung pinaka-appropriate na paraan para masagot mo siya, no? And then yung methods ba na ginagamit mo is to advance, can it advance the discipline? Kasi yung isa sa mga major criticism sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino, parang ang bagal daw ng theory development, ang bagal ng mga pag-aaral. And I think it stems from hindi pa tayo confident to say which method is the most appropriate. But I think if we are going to be a little bit more flexible, we can advance the field faster. That is my take. I don't know if you agree with that, No? But that's how I see it, how we can contribute to the field.
Oh, so sorry, yung pagiging debatable po niya, doon lang po sa aspect na hindi naman nakakahon sa qualitative methods yung Sikolohiyang Pilipino, bagkus ay kasama rin, pwedeng isama talaga din yung quantitative methods. Tama po ba?
Yeah, well, at least that is my view on the issue. Kasi yun nga parang meron talagang mga nilalatag nung umpisa na very prescriptivist way of doing things. Unfortunately, kapag very prescriptivist ka kasi sa metodolohiya, marami kang mga tanong na hindi masasagot.
Although sir, given po, sorry sir, medyo makulit. Although given po yung mga nabanggit na, parang sa mga nasabi niyo po, pag ang main focus pa rin po is yung method na gagamitin ay iaakma dapat talaga doon sa kilalanin yung kalahok para maiakma yung metodo doon sa kanila at doon sa topic mismo na pinag-aaralan.
Correct.
Apo.
Iaakma yung tama. Yeah.
Thank you po.
Okay. Sige, anything else you'd like to add or raise before I proceed?
Sir
Yes,
Ton,
please.
mag-express lang po ako ng tuwa.
Ay, saan
Kasi
po?
natutuwa po talaga ako dito sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino. Kasi parang makikita mo na may pagpapahalaga sa mga values ng ating bansa, ng ating tao na hindi naman dapat tanggalin rin yung universally accepted eh. Kasi I've learned in one Coursera course sa social psychology na tayo daw mga human beings, we're actually one in a sense, no? Parang may mga pagkakaisa rin naman po. Kaya nga natuwa rin po ako doon sa diskurso tungkol sa indigenization without saka indigenization within. Kasi pwede nga naman balansehin po yung dalawa na hindi naman totally tatanggalin natin yung mga teorya na nanggaling sa labas. Pero yun nga, iwasan nga po natin. Salamat po sa pagpapaliwanag ng angat patong. Kasi ang ganda noon, no, na parang hindi lang natin iaangkat mula sa ibang bansa at ipapatong sa atin. Bagkus titinan natin paano siya mag-gel dito sa ating sariling konteksto. So parang yun po yung natutuwa ko sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino. Salamat po.
Thank you, Rolly, for expressing that. Ako talagang natutuwa talaga ako sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino at sana as we kind of progress in the semester, you'd also feel the same way and also help in developing the field. Okay. Any question that you'd like to raise at this point about this?
Sir, doon sa regarding doon sa Sikolohiyang walang kinalaman sa mga Pilipino.
Okay.
So it could mean that a certain person is doing a study in the Philippines but does not involve any Filipino that is part of that. Kumaga,
Yes.
kahit na dito sa Pilipinas ginagawa yung kanyang study, pero wala siyang mga pwede po ba yun na wala siyang subject na Pilipino. So that means to say, andun siya sa point ng Sikolohiyang walang kinalaman sa Pilipino kahit sa Pilipinas na ginagawa.
Yes, agree. So that forms part of it. Yes, you're right.
Okay po.
Ganon
Thank
din
you.
yung lahat ng mga journal articles, lahat ng mga textbooks na inaaral natin. I think yung easy way to understand it they're found here in the Philippines. So any psychological knowledge found here falls under psikolohiya sa Pilipinas na posibleng walang kinalaman sa atin. So importante for me yung qualifier na katutubo kasi it connects SP with the indigenous psychology movement. No? And basically itong part na to, yung bunga siya ng KKO, drives home the point that culture is at the forefront in Sikolohiyang Pilipino. No? So talagang kakalkalin mo yung mga karanasan, kaisipan, at orientasyon ng mga Pilipino. So any questions here?
Sir, ano pong difference ng kaisipan sa orientasyon?
Okay. Yan yung isa sa usual na na condition. Actually, yung orientasyon naman talaga can fall under kaisipan. Pero usually, yung orientasyon, we can think of it as the framework. Kasi yung karanasan, malawak yan, di ba? So, experiences. Basically, yung kaisipan at orientasyon can fall under karanasan kasi karanasan involves thinking, feeling, behaving. Yung kaisipan, ito yung mas cognitive component, no? Yung thought processes natin. So, ang nagpa-fall under dyan usually ay beliefs, values, no? Yung mga kino-consider natin na mga cognitive concepts. Yung orientasyon, nilagay yan dyan, I think to emphasize the point of, kasi diba, to orient yourself, meaning to sort of give you a particular direction or how to view the world. No? So yung orientasyon dito, ibig sabihin, locally derived frameworks. At least that's how I make sense of what orientasyon means. So halimbawa, yung paggamit ng loob, labas, lalim para unawain yung konsepto ng sarili. So that is an example of Filipino orientation. Kasi ibig sabihin, local concept, local framework siya. So parang mas complex siya in that. It's an organization of the way we view the world.
Thank you po.
Hindi lang siya bastang paniniwala o prinsipyo, mga ganun. Okay?
Okay po.
Thank you. Sige. So, nabanggit na natin to, yung role ng culture sa SP, no? So here, may question dun sa reading memo about, at kung makikita niyo dito may question mark din dyan, may question sa reading memo about, meron ba talagang lugar yung quantitative studies? And I hope I was able to answer that in my previous response sa SP. So, ang sagot ko ay meron, as long as it is aware of the lived experiences and realities of your participant.
Sir?
Yes, please?
Hindi ko po masabing fully indigenous, pero pwedeng ipasok. Halimbawa, noong meron pa pong Gen Psych sa curriculum ng college students, pwedeng isama as one of the chapters yung SP sa pagtuturo nito. Kasama nung mga iba pang mga chapters on emotions, on conditioning, lahat po ng mga yun kasama pa rin, pero merong parte o chapter on SP, and kung kakayanin ay yung mga halimbawa na ibinibigay kahit dun sa mga foreign concepts, medyo semi-angat patong, pero gawing may kinalaman dun sa experiences ng mga estudyante, ng mga Pilipino, ng mga tao dito sa Pilipinas. Yun po.
Okay. Thank you for that, Tia. Agree, no, na yung SP hindi lang siya footnote, but it's actually its own, it can stand side by side with yung mga social cognitive theories, yung mga theories on personality, biological perspectives. No? Yeah, true. And actually, examples are excellent. No? And in fact, one would be having our own textbook talaga. No? Na sa, halimbawa, yung karanasan sa New Zealand, sobrang ang galing, ang radical, at least in my perspective. Sa kanila, halimbawa, when they teach social psychology, hindi sila nagbe-base on sa available textbooks. So they talk about ano yung relevant sa atin, tas dun, yun yung mga topics nila, at yun yung textbook nila. So parang sumulat talaga sila ng sarili nilang textbook na iba yung outline kumpara sa classic way of teaching social psych. So si Nico sabi niya, pwede bang Filipino yung ginagamit? Yan din yung isang sinasuggest nila. Pag Filipino yung gamit mo, that might be a good indicator. Or pwedeng mother tongue-based instruction. So kung Cebuano, or kung ano man yung mga major languages that are appropriate in that context. Yeah.
May dagdag po ako kasi
Yes.
galing rin po ako sa College of Education.
Yes, please.
And there was a time na pinagturo kami ng matematika in Tagalog. So imagine yung even numbers tinatawag namin pares, odd numbers are gansal. Pero it seems na parang yun nga pag masyadong in-indigenize yung mga terminology, parang minsan mas nalilito yung bata. No? Lalo na pag siya ay lumaki na tapos napunta siguro sa kolehiyo o sa ibang parang I think yun nga yun, parang a sweet mixture of the indigenization without and indigenization within might be able to help to create a more indigenous teaching of psychology. Natutuwa po ako doon sa tinuring nyo kasi pwede nga po yun na parang ibabase mo sa sariling karanasan ng bata at mas magiging interactive siya eh. Kasi for example, imagine secondary high school students talking about hiya or utang na loob and such that, no? Parang malapit sa puso ng mga kabataan po itong mga terminology nito. So parang masayang pag-usapan siya sa loob ng classroom po. Yun lang mo.
Right. Thank you. And I think that would also make it easier for students to connect with the lesson. No? Kasi they see themselves in what we're studying. Okay? Sige. So, dun naman sa research, yeah, so nabanggit ni Nico na big step yung meron tayong handbook ng SP kasi ibig sabihin meron tayong resources no, na tayo yung nag-aaral. Sorry, meron tayong resources na mas local kasi ang hirap maghanap ng local studies. No? So at least yung handbook is really a collection of those studies. Sige. So, so this is something to think about. I don't know, Rolly, alam ko counseling yung area mo, right? So I don't know if you have something to say about professional practice.
Yeah, actually po nabanggit ko po 'yon sa reading memo ko po na isang insight ko po, I was doing SP na pala even when I was doing my master's level. Kasi my master's thesis was counseling the Filipino male homosexual and I was able to ask permission from Passinger and Moore, one of those psychologists to develop these skills, no, for people, no, who are experiencing homosexuality. So, nandiyan po yung gay identity scale sa kaya outness inventory. And I know that I was studying Filipino male homosexual. So, parang sabi ko, hindi yata swak kung ibibigay ko sa kanila yung ganitong instrument kasi lalo na yung ibang mga cases ko po ay talagang high school lang inabot. So what I did was I asked permission from them to actually tagalize it. No? Ginawa ko pong Filipino and then I had my statistician professor help me out in terms of validation and reliability stages. At yun po na although hindi ko po alam kung tama nga po yung proseso, pero at least naman po na ipasa ko naman po yung thesis for counseling the Filipino may homosexual. So, malaking kaya nga po, sobrang natuwa po ako nung binabasa ko itong mga readings. Sabi ko, I realized, parang hindi natin nare-realize, ginagawa na pala natin na yung SP, no? Just by merely translating a foreign instrument into a Filipino instrument.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that.
Sige.
So itong outreach, we'll get to that when we talk about the movement aspect, okay? So, yeah. So now we talk about how to develop the field, okay? So I think si Kim may question siya about indigenization, but I'm not quite sure exactly what it is. So I don't know. Kim, would you like to, I don't know if it's still a question, but if it's still something that you'd like to raise?
Yeah, sir. The problem kasi yung mga scholar like si Virgilio and Salazar, meron sila mga conflicting ideas kaya katulad ng pantayong pananaw na tayo lang daw kailangan. So doon ako nahirapan sa paggamit ng indigenization.
Okay. So kung tama yung intindi ko dun sa question mo, Kim, is there a right way of doing or developing the field? Ganun kaya pinagmumula ng question? No? Kasi totoo yun, no? Nagde-diverge yung pantayong pananaw sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino kasi isa sa mga point of contention ni Doc E at saka ni Dr. Salazar si Dr. Salazar ang ama ng pantayang pananaw. Para kay Dr. Salazar, kapag wala ka na sa Pilipinas, hindi ka na necessarily Pilipino. May ganun siyang very purista talaga ng notion ng Pilipino.
Yeah, and according to my reading, kahit pag nagsalita ka ng English sa mga conference niya, parang hindi siya natutuwa.
Yeah, that's true. So I think what we're trying to say here, and baka mas ma-clarify, hopefully Kim yung question mo dun sa next part, ay there is parang dahil SP yung nagkikritik sa status quo, no? It had to start somewhere. Kailangan niya ng pambuo nung kanyang psychological knowledge base. No? So kaya it had to start from somewhere. No? Kaya halimbawa, yung idea ng personality test, pwede mong i-argue na, mga personality test, ano yan, that's very Western in nature. Pero ang argument ni Dr. Enriquez, but it's informative in understanding the Filipino. So kahit si Dr. Enriquez, meron siyang sarili niyang personality test. I think it was mentioned in the reading memo, yung panukat ng ugali at pagkatao. But, so the point here is there are different routes to indigenization. There are different routes to developing SP. And then at the beginning, the easiest way to develop the field would be to see what is useful outside and adapt it to the local context. No? So in that sense, kung makita talaga natin dito, ang isang insight dito ay si Dr. Enriquez, yung vision niya for SP, very flexible, very open, no? Hindi niya sinasara na pang tayo, no? Na atin lang lahat. No? May space for foreign studies, no? Or foreign methodologies, foreign concepts, even in the Philippines. And there's a question here about is there why don't we do away, no, with mainstream or foreign Euro-American psychology? And I'd like to bring up what Dr. Enriquez said. No? Sabi niya, kasing dangerous ng uncritical rejection of anything foreign, ang uncritical acceptance of anything local. No? So, let me repeat that. So, para kay Dr. Enriquez, dangerous yung uncritical rejection of anything foreign. So, again, it gives us an insight of how there's openness there. No? And then also, uncritical acceptance of anything local. No? So, ang point dito ay, bakit may space? May space kasi, may space ang foreign concepts kasi nga, kung useful siya to understand who we are or kung useful siya to solve a topical issue, then it's very efficient that we adapt than completely do away. No? Halimbawa, issues ng drug use. No? So itong administrasyon na to, meron siyang fascination, no? sa drug use, drug war, drug rehabilitation. No? Ang dami ng mga pag-aaral na nagawa about drug use. No? At maganda yung point na sinabi ni Rolly kanina na, to a certain extent, because we're all human beings, and to a certain extent, we have more or less similar physiology, yung epekto kasi ng drugs are highly physiological. May epekto siya sa brain functioning. So marami ng mga pag-aaral about addiction. So parang baka irresponsible naman to turn a blind eye to all these studies when we can use them. Same is true with studies, halimbawa, on corporal punishment. Di ba meron tayong idea of lowering the age of lowering the age of criminal responsibility. May mga hunghang tayong mga tagagawa ng batas. So, na gusto gawin yan, ang dami ng mga pag-aaral about incarcerating the young, no? About being very punitive when it comes to children, na ginawa sa West. No? So, we can adapt what we can and see what works for us, but not completely reject them. No? And same is true with what Doki is saying, na hindi naman porke local, tatanggapin mo na lang basta-basta. Kasi halimbawa, if your culture is highly patriarchal, no, which leads to, misogyny and marginalization of sexual minorities, okay lang ba yun? Kasi dahil quote-unquote Filipino culture yung patriarchy, tatanggapin na lang ba natin siya? Hindi rin, it doesn't work that way also. So we have to be very critical, not just of what is outside, but also what is within. Essentially, what we're saying here is, at ito rin yung binabanggit ni Rolly kanina, that the ideal goal is to find a good mix, at least for now. At least for now. At nabanggit din ni, maganda yung binanggit ni Mark kanina about, hopefully we reach that point where we're confident enough, where the discipline is rich enough, such that, we can easily distinguish what is foreign, what is adapted, and what is our own, what is really locally derived. Okay? Sige. Itong nabanggit to kanina ni Pia, yung specific aspects, these are the specific aspects of contributing. So the reason why, isa sa mga dahilan ko ba't suot ko yung article na yun is, it's actually really for students. So when they ask, kasi tuturo ako ng undergrad na SP, at isa sa mga tanong nila ay, paano ko ba ito gagawin? Or if you're a beginning researcher and you want to contribute to SP, so ito yung at least, if you have an awareness of these specific aspects of indigenization, it makes it easier, to frame your study na Sikolohiyang Pilipino siya. So the ideal goal really is to be able to incorporate all these things in one study. So kung magawa mo yan, parang, that's amazing. So diba, sumagot ka ng local issue, tapos yung ginamit mo pa na metodo, highly relevant to the Philippine context, or bumuo ka ng metodo na appropriate sa context natin, and then yung concept pa na inaaral mo ay local. At kagaya nga nung nabanggit ko dun sa research, yung clinical psychology actually is doing a fantastic work pagdating dito sa indigenization. Kasi sila malinaw So, yung problema local. Diba? Kasi problems of living in the Philippines. So, halimbawa, problema sa adjustment sa panahon ng pandemya. Tas marami silang mga framework na ginagamit. Halimbawa, si Dr. Salvador, meron siyang Duda framework, mga ganyan. Tapos yung concept na inaaral mo nga ay pagkabagabag, halimbawa, sa Pilipinas. So that kind of captures all of these elements perfectly. Okay? Sige. So, and then just for the final point, may tanong, hindi ko alam kung si Gladys would like to bring it up. I think meron siyang question about, is Sikolohiyang Pilipino free and liberating, and how does that look like? Tama ba ako, Gladys? And would you like to bring that up?
Yes, sir. Kasi po, di ba po yung sabi nga, may emancipatory potential kasi yung SP na hindi lang siya parang you describe, kasi the point is to also to change. So yung tanong ko po, paano po itong free and liberating na aspeto ng SP, paano po ito mai-incorporate doon sa, halimbawa sa methodology niya, doon sa framework?
Sige, thank you. Sige. So before we go to that, baka maganda na tingnan natin yung 3 areas of protest niya. Doon sa, kung tama yung alala ko, doon sa reading memo ni Kim, parang na-differentiate niya to. Kim, would you like to try and briefly talk about these 3 areas of protest?
Oh yeah.
Sige.
Dr. Robert E. Javier, the Associate Professor of De La Salle University, explained those protests. Sabi niya, it is against a psychology that perpetuates the colonial status of the Filipino mind, a psychology used to exploitation of the masses and the imposition of psychologists developed in foreign countries.
Right. Okay, thank you, Kim. So, yan yung binabanggit natin na so far, ang project talaga ng SP, mas parang decolonization pa siya. Malaya from foreign influence, mapagpalaya, meaning liberating the oppressed, liberating people who are marginalized, and then also yung freedom from yung colonial way of framing the world. So is that possible? I think it is, basta malinaw sa'yo kung anong sektor yung pinagtutuunan mo ng pansin sa pag-aaral mo. Kasi magiging liberating lang ang isang pag-aaral kung may topical concern siya talaga na ina-address. So, halimbawa, yun yung kainaman ng pag-aaral sa Pilipinas, ang dami nating problema. Lahat ng sektor may problema. So, halimbawa, yung LGBT psychology, I think that would be a good example of free and liberating na mga pag-aaral in the Philippines kasi they talk about discrimination, they talk about coming out, they talk about experiences, giving voices. Yung isang paraan to do that, no? Hindi siya necessarily transformative in the makayanig mundong sense, but when you give voice to people who don't have voices and put them front and center in your study. So halimbawa maraming nagsasabi na yung buhay ng trans people, trans men, trans women, bisexual individuals, so they're not heard, no? Their experiences are not heard. So when you give them a voice in your study, then that's one way of liberating them already. Pero yung bigger goal really is to be able to influence policy through your work. No, so halimbawa, isang study na ginagawa namin ay tungkol sa living wage. No? So, nanggagaling kami sa paniniwala na, so ang sektor na sinusubukan naming tulungan ay, syempre, yung marginalized, the poor, no? And we are coming from the idea that the minimum wage is not enough. So kailangan we call it a living wage, that the wage that people get should enable them or enable us to pursue things that we value. No? So kung mahal kasi yung pamilya mo, dapat na-enable ka ng sweldo na nakukuha mo para, mas mapahalagahan mo pa yung pamilya mo. No? So, magiging liberating siya kung umabot na sa punto na yung pag-aaral mo, bawa yung living wage study, can inform policy and then the government will say, okay, let's adopt this. And then it's a step closer to moving people outside of the poverty trap. Parang ganun. Sorry, that was a very long answer, guys. But the point there is, it's a slow development because a lot of the studies are focusing on these three areas of protest that are highly decolonization in nature. No? The next level would be to give voices to the marginalized. And then the last level would really be creating studies that are highly applied, interventionist, and then seeing how they can really change, how people live and hopefully contribute to reduction of inequalities. A lot of you asked about post-structuralism, and I wanted you to read the article of Dr. Ong kasi makikita natin dun yung what I just mentioned, na yung isang first level would be to critique and challenge. To get to the liberation part, it's important first to unpack ano ba yung mga problema na kinakaharap ng mga tao. So yung particular area of interest niya ay migration. So ang binigyan niya ng boses doon sa, actually aging and migration yung area niya. So ang binigyan niya ng boses ay yung mga older population and who happen to be immigrants in New Zealand. No? So that's actually one way of one step closer to liberation. No? And importante, yung post-structuralism is not very easy to define. And in fact, tatawa ako, pag nakakita kayo ng marami mga pag-aaral marami mga papel na nagde-define ito, they really elude definition. Kasi ang pinagbumulan nito ay postmodernism. Yung idea na there's just no one way of doing things and no one way of defining things. No? But hopefully, yung simpleng paraan ng pag-unawa sa post-structuralism, yung bakit siya post-structuralism? So kasi yung structuralism, ang sinasabi niya ay that that individuals have underlying structures that we can unearth. So lahat tayo, pare-pareho, lahat tayo may mga structures of thinking, may structures yung mind natin, na pag inaral natin siya, maintindihan natin yung sangkatauhan. So, yun yung isang binabangga ng post-structuralism, na ang sinasabi niya, walang iisang structure, walang iisang sistema na stable or fixed. No? So, the way that we understand the world are culturally and historically situated. So you have to constantly look at anong panahon yan inaral at anong konteksto, no, yung inaral mo. So that's one important thing about post-structuralism. Situating studies locally and historically. Yung second na importante na malaman natin about post-structuralism ay crucial sa kanya yung power. So, kailangan sa pag-aaral mo, binabangga mo yung power relations. At that hindi ka nagpa-perpetuate ng power inequalities. So, that's why one concrete way of doing that is to give voices to people who are not heard. At yung third, I think that one way to operationalize post-structuralism is that crucial sa kanila yung pag-aaral ng diskurso o text. No, ibig sabihin, to be able to understand how the world works, you have to understand how people talk about things. You have to deconstruct and reconstruct how texts are presented. How is that specifically? So si Dr. Ong, ang tinignan niya, yung mga pamphlets na nilalabas ng gobyerno tungkol sa mga migrant workers. No? So a pamphlet or an ad, no, di ba? Isn't it horrific to know that there are actually ads, no, na galing sa mismong gobyerno natin na nag-encourage talaga, basically. So talagang nagnilalako yung ating mga migrant workers sa mga bansa. So, yung mga ganong teksto, pag inaral mo siya, basically, ang sinasabi ng post-structuralism, what does that say, no, about how the government views our migrant workers? Ano yung namamayaning meanings, no, pagdating sa migrant workers? So ano yung nakita niya? So yun talaga, na pag nilako tayo, we are naturally caring. So that's why we are perfect caregivers. Basically, yun yung isang lumalabas. And in relation to the power relations, what does that do? No, what does that do? It makes it easy to sell us. And then it makes it easy to sell us without safeguards. So it often leads to a lot of abuse. No? So parang ganyan yung idea ng post-structuralist na view eh. No? Tignan mo, how do people talk about things? No? And then see what you can, ano yung makikita mong problematic about power structure, about status quo, that you can challenge and critique. So ito yung basically what Dr. Ang is saying about integrating post-structuralism to Sikolohiyang Pilipino. It is a lens, no, that we can use. At magandang reminder siya. Kasi nga, ang sinasabi niya, para mabago mo, dapat maging aware ka dun sa gusto mong baguhin. No? So dapat kaya mo mag-critique at mag-challenge ng mga bagay-bagay.
Hi, sir.
Yes, please.
Napakaganda po kasi nung sinabi po doon ni Dr. Ong, yung, di ba po kasi parang sinituate niya to, isang napaka-neoliberal na environment. Paano yung, halimbawa, yung tinatanggap na lang nila na ito talaga yung buhay namin kahit mababa yung sahod namin. Paano po ito nai-imbibe na parang meron ka ng consent talaga na hindi na parang taken for granted na lang. Tapos sa'yo, nalilegitimize ito kasi yung individual din po mismo na mamask yung problema na dapat systemic or structural kasi parang nagiging individual responsibility ito, yung idea po ng agency at paano ito ginagamit para mas ma-perpetuate itong unequal power relations.
Thank you so much for that, Dad. I think you summed up that article very well. So yan, so hopefully pag nakita natin yung sabi ni Gladys, it captures the essence of yung post-structuralism. Kasi comes from that big concept of neoliberalism, and then critiquing how people talk about their migrant experiences through that lens and see what is problematic about that. Yun. Okay? So ngayon, ang tanong, just to sum this up, no? So, disiplina at kilusan. So, disiplina, kasi merong paraan ng paggawa ng mga bagay-bagay. So, dun pumapasok yung indigenization and then specific aspects of indigenization. May mga rules. Kasi yun yung point ng discipline. May rules yung field, and then we operate along those rules. No? So, yung movement aspect, what that is really saying is, dun sa rules mo, sa paggawa ng psikolohiya, no? Pag-enact mo ng psikolohiya, it should be very cognizant that your discipline should lead to liberation. Your discipline should lead to helping the marginalized, basically. No? So yung discipline mo should lead to this. That, that it should change oppressive relations, oppressive situations, inequalities, etc. So mahirap yun talaga gawin in the bigger scheme of things. But, so you have to be aware of that. Na yung pag-aaral na ginagawa mo, ideally, contributes. Kahit maliit, gano'n naman yung research incremental naman talaga yung contribution lagi But it should lead eventually to a change. Changing something. So, halimbawa, social inequality, that is a huge problem. So if we can move towards that, then if our studies can contribute to understanding that, challenging that, and then providing solutions for that, then that would be a huge step forward for Sikolohiyang Pilipino.
Hi, sir.
Yes.
Hello.
Yep.
Hello po.
Yes, Trisha.
Gusto ko lang, may na-realize lang ako. Kasi dati kasi akong para OFW ako dati. Tapos parang sa Singapore po. Tapos parang napansin ko lang rin kasi na parang mga Pilipino po yung laging pinapaggawa or parang naabuso sa pag-OT, ganyan. Tapos parang laging feeling ko nabibida ng mga kapwa ko Pilipino yung ganun talaga kasi resilience and whatnot. Tapos parang na-realize ko rin parang based dito sa mga readings na to na parang kailangan kong parang i-unlearn yung paano ba? Parang kailangan ko i-unlearn yung ibang Filipino traits na we all know so well na parang yung tipong nasasanay na magtrabaho na okay lang. So parang feeling ko pinosisyon ko yung pag-isip ko dati na medyo westernized para lang hindi ako ma-abuse sa work. Am I making sense po ba sa sinasabi ko?
Yes, actually. Thank you for sharing your experiences, Trisha. Anything else you'd like to add to that?
Yun po, parang hindi po ba Pilipino, very Filipino or mali po ba yung ganong pag-isip na parang kailangan kong tanggalin yung parang lente ba? Or yung, parang, kasi parang nung time na yun, parang naisip ko na sinasabi ko sa mga katrabaho ko na dapat hindi kayo pumayag na ganyan. Parang in a way, I was trying to think like one of my Western colleagues na no, you shouldn't be abused. Dapat you should be entitled, be more entitled, ganyan. Right. So, ayun.
I think yung magandang sinasabi nga nung article ni Dr. Ong kasi sinasabi niya, yung hindi natin necessarily kasalanan kung gano'n natin i-frame yung mga karanasan natin. Kasi gano'n tayo sinocialize, gano'n tayo tinuruan. Kahit yung mismong gobyerno natin, gano'n tayo finiframe sa ibang bansa. So, there's a lot of, ang ganda ng word na ginagawa, there's a lot of unlearning, and unlearning something is not very easy, But the point I think that's important is na meron tayong awareness na kung ganun tayo mag-isip, yung pattern natin ganun, maapi talaga tayo. And that's precisely what we want to avoid. Parang okay lang naman magtrabaho sa ibang bansa. I mean, that's not, we shouldn't prevent people from seeking opportunities wherever, but that alam natin na hindi porke Pilipino tayo, pwede tayo maapi, pwede mas mababa yung sweldo, yung mga ganun mga bagay-bagay. So, yeah.
Sir, may question lang po ako regarding, sorry, nag-digress na ako dun sa mga unang slides. It is about po yung critique about engaging in quantitative research. Tama po ba? Tama po ba na parang may critic yung ibang mga taga-SP about doing quantitative research because most of it will be coming from the Western ideologies? Tama po ba?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, one is yes, coming from the West. So, kasi yung mga purista talaga, anti-West. Anything West is wrong. No? Pero
Yeah.
pangalawa, and I think a lot of our degrees, no, pag nag-graduate school, mas malalim yung pag-aaral natin ng mga metodolohiya. A lot of these methods have epistemological grounding. Ibig sabihin may philosophical, basis. No? So,
Which is medyo neo-colonial in nature, parang ganon.
Neo-colonial, ibig sabihin it can perpetuate power imbalance. Pwede rin siyang yung positivistic na mas importante sa yung patterns na universal instead of surfacing individual voices, yung mga ganun. So these are things that people are critiquing. No? So, yeah.
Pero natutuwa lang po ako kasi feeling ko, ang nangyayari po ngayon, parang we're planting seeds na. And the seeds are actually the psychological concepts that are uniquely Filipino. And nakikita ko lang po, possibly may mga umuusbong na ng mga seeds na yan. Like possibly hiya, for example. Kung umusbong na yan at dumago na, possibly we could already do some quantitative research about it para lalong dumago pa itong konsepto nito. Kasi parang the seeds is really the concepts pa lang eh. Pero pag lumaki na po siya, pwede na po natin gamitan ng ibang konsepto.
Right. Okay. Just a quick comment, Rolly, dun sa sinabi mo. May isang article na sinasabi na mahirap, kaya I also try to deviate from saying yung Sikolohiyang Pilipino ay pag-aaral ng mga unique Filipino concepts kasi yung isang argument para masabi na daw natin na unique, dapat may ebidensya tayo na wala tayong katulad sa kahit anong bansa sa buong mundo. But that's a tall order. No? So, kaya ang laging ginagamit ay basta culturally relevant siya. No? So, hindi kailangan tayo lang yung meron, pero mahalaga siya sa atin, sa pag-unawa ng karanasan natin. Yun lang. Yeah. Thanks for that point.
Yeah. Saka feeling ko po sir, yung concept ng regionalism, ito sa medyo matibay na parang feeling ko dividing sword sa ating lahat bilang Pilipino. I think isa yun sa mga pwedeng makita sa SP na paano kung indigenous lang siya for a particular, for example, Cebuano lang, ang may ganitong konsepto, parang it's still SP po, no? Tama po.
Precisely, correct. Thank you for that point. That's very important. So it doesn't have to be all Filipinos. It can be, and actually that's the point. It doesn't have to be universal to all Filipinos, but it can be specific to a particular cultural group. Yeah.
Salamat po. Actually, yung regionalism ang medyo malapit sa puso ko na parang feeling ko kung sakaling matutuloy ako sa SP, yun yung gusto kong pag-aralan. Kasi feeling ko, a lot of our problems right now as a Filipino, not being able to unite really as a nation, stems from the regionalism.
True. So that's a very complex topic. And yeah, I'd love to hear more about that work kung sakaling matuloy. Thanks, Rolly.
Salamat po.
Yeah, Pia?
Sir, mabilis lang po. Hindi ko alam kung medyo mababaw kasi, pero I found myself kasi having difficulties sa pagbabasa po nung artikulo ni Dr. Ong. And na-realize ko lang na almost every line, tinatranslate ko sa utak ko into English yung mga terminologies na ginamit niya. And napaisip tuloy ako kung mas magiging epektibo ba talaga ang pagtuturo ng SP o pag-aaral ng SP kung gagamitin ang wikang sariling atin sa proseso. Kasi taal na Bulakenyo po ako pero naging mabigat pa rin sa akin yung mga ibang terms para mas madaling maintindihan. Feeling ko mas madali pang naintindihan yung mga nasa English na articles. Ayun po.
Yeah, that's actually a very valid point, Pia. And I think it stems from iba kasi yung nagbabasa ng academic text in Filipino. Kasi, if it were like chismis from pep.ph or something, baka mas madali siya, di ba? Kasi sanay tayo dun eh. Pero hindi tayo trained ever since we were younger na magbasa ng teksto na ganito sa Filipino. So, the challenge is really, it's very understandable. And siguro kaya nagsisingit din ako once in a while ng mga ganito para masanay din tayo na magbasa at umunawa sa isang local language naman. And honestly, ang lament ko ay ang kaunti nung ganito. Kasi feeling ko dapat kung may isang subject na pupwersahin tayo na magbasa, kahit nahirap na tayo, would be something like Sikolohiyang Pilipino. And it stems from that bigger problem of the neo-colonial nature of our education, which really services, kasi babalik ka naman tayo sa malaking issue ng neoliberalism, etc. We're being trained in the service of a globalized goal more than, baka na mas localized yung ating objectives for studying. Yeah. So, yeah, paumanhin ko medyo naging, kasi kahit ako nahirapan din ako, pero maganda that we sort of practice. Yeah, oo, pasensya na mahirap na yung topic, mahirap pa na hindi tayo sanay. Pero yun nga, parang we have to, ang stand ko dito ay kahit mahirap siya, kailangan natin subukan, kahit subukan lang, no? Kasi, yun nga, eventually, if we're going to speak to a particular kind of audience, di ba? Wika naman nila yung gagamitin natin. So, mainam na nagpa-practice din tayo mag-conceptualize academically, no? In another language. Yeah. Yun. So, yes, actually, I hope sana nga dumating yung punto na mas maging less rigid yung academic community. Ang stricto ng academic community sa wika eh. May mga gatekeepers din, no? So baka ang hindi magbago, baka matagal magbago yung forma ng academic research and academic language, pero ang pwedeng contribution natin is to lay personize this research and use our own language and spin to these things, no? Kasi ang argument nila palagi ay iba yung audience ng academic papers. Ang audience niya ay academic community. So ibang challenge pa yung translating academic text to something that people will appreciate and understand. Yeah.
Sir, isa na lang po.
Sige, please.
Posible po kayang dumating yung time na matatanggap yung, ayun, sinabi niya, yung Taglish. Pero yung term ko is mga salitang balbal sa academic papers.
Alam mo, dapat may magsimula, feeling ko. Tingnan natin kung yung PSSP, kaya yan. Feeling ko magsi-special, sabihin ko, suggest ko na mag-special issue tukol sa ganyan, balbal or Taglish or whatever. There has to be a strong community who will push for it. Unfortunately, it's not very easy because yun nga yung merong mga perspektiba na ganito lang yung itsura ng Filipino. So we have to kind of abide by those rules. Tapos meron ding rules sa academic writing. So we also have to abide by those rules. So yun, dami nating rules. Pero yun nga, if there's one thing that we're learning here in this class is that it's important to critique and challenge the status quo if it services the bigger goal of emancipation. So there. Sige. Pwede naman akong advisor.
Ay sir, sorry. May
Sige.
naalala lang ako na nagtanong sa akin na wala na hindi rin nag-masters ko, tsaka yung gusto talaga niyang matuto at makibasa yung mga papel na pinagsusulat ng mga nasa academe din. Parang may posibilidad daw ba na may isa pang mas understandable na version yung ibang papers. Kasi parang gusto daw talaga nilang matuto, tapos parang gusto nilang matutunan yung mga sulat din ng mga taga-academe, pero meron daw bang tiyataw na gitna in the future if ever. Kasi naiintindihan ko naman na yung mga papers talaga is para sa, yun nga, sa academe talaga. May posibilidad daw ba na yun nga, may parang gitna. Ayun, di ko masyado may explain eh. Ayun.
Actually, marami ng mga journals sa psychology na mas yung isang ginagawa nila ngayon, yung isang good practice nila ay dapat kaya mong in 1 to 2 sentences, dapat kaya mong sabihin in lay person language what your study is about. So bukod sa abstract, meron ka pang ganung requirement na 1 to 2 sentences for the public use. So that's one step. Pangalawa, meron ng mga journals ngayon na ano talaga siya, it's for, I forget the title of that journal. It's anyway, the point is, ano siya, mas accessible yung language. Mas accessible yung language. Less technical. So, tapos may ibang mga may mga ibang journals na mas maiigsi. Parang pinupuwersa niya yung mga authors to write simply in a short manner. So, at least in the West, we're moving towards that. And hopefully, there will come a time na sa Philippines, may ganun ding spaces. It's really a matter of having spaces for these articles. And we'll see, maybe, hopefully PSSP can do something in the future about this. Yeah. I'll probably get to see you in 2 weeks, okay? If you have any other questions or concerns, let me know. Thank you so much for making time, and kahit nang haba-haba na ng klase natin, thanks for being there. And hopefully things were clarified in tonight's discussion.